Hey, if you're a fan of the band Yes, I think you will enjoy what we have for you here today. Now, a few weeks ago, we put out a video about the band HSAS, which was kind of a super group, Hagar, Sean, Aronson, Shreve. And somebody that comments on our videos quite a bit actually put a comment down underneath that video that said, I think 90125 by Yes would be an interesting choice to see what people thought about when it came out. Now, those of you that don't know what we do here, what we do is we go back and we take some of these great albums and things that happened back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and go back and look at what people were saying about them at the time. And so this album by Yes, which came out in 1983, was actually it was a very, very important album in the history of the band Yes. And so when I read that, I thought that would actually be really cool to go back and do one of our little videos about 90125 and go read some record reviews and see what we could find. So I immediately went back and started doing some research and found a couple of really cool things that I think you will like. And this was a really important album, like I said, partly because this album was first of all, the biggest selling album that Yes ever put out. But there were probably a lot of people that had never even heard of Yes that heard of them for the first time when this album came out, which is pretty significant considering the fact that they'd been around since the late 60s. So it's hard to tell the story of this album without at least rewinding just a little bit. So I just want to spend just a second talking about where Yes came from. See, so Yes started back in the late 60s with a guy named Jon Anderson, and he was the singer, and a bassist named Chris Squire. And they are the two guys that really were the core of the band Yes. And Yes has this something similar to what the band Rush does, and that is in the singer. Jon Anderson, the singer for Yes, has this voice that you hear it and you just know instantly. And even though Yes was a progressive band that was known for its incredible musicianship and the detailed music they do, it just, without that voice, I mean, Jon Anderson's voice was really the connection that so many people just had into that music. It was the gateway to kind of get into this complicated stuff that they were doing. But again, it was just, you hear Jon Anderson and you know it's Jon Anderson. And I compare it to Geddy Lee because Geddy Lee from Rush, you hear Geddy Lee and you just know it's Geddy Lee. And both of them have these really, really high-pitched voices that very distinct and kind of awesome. So Jon Anderson, again, was one of the guys that formed this band way back in the 60s. And the first couple albums they put out didn't really do super well. It wasn't until they put out their third album, and I'll show you that one right here. I happen to have an old copy of this thing, and it was called the Yes album. And this is the first one that featured the guitarist named Steve Howe. And Steve Howe ended up being a really incredibly important part of this band. And it was kind of funny because whenever I think of Yes, and see if you can, I know we have a lot of musicians that watch these videos, and I'm going to see if this relates to anybody. When I first started playing the electric guitar back in 7th grade, it was what was called junior high school back at the time. There was a kid in our school that had long hair, and he was a guitar player, and he was just kind of known as he was the best guitar player in the school. And he was always carrying his guitar around. And one of the things that he was really into was the band Yes. And of course, specifically because of Steve Howe, because everybody kind of knew that Steve Howe was this incredible guitar player. So it was a little bit of a nerdy thing that if you were a guitar player, well, at least in our school, because of this one guy, you kind of had to know who Yes was and Steve Howe. And so I'm actually curious if you had somebody like that in your school where you had to like Yes because of the musicianship if you started playing the guitar, or if you were the guy that was the Yes fan. Because it seemed like there was always somebody around that was into Yes just because of the progressive rock and the incredible arrangements and the incredible musicianship. Anyway, so Steve Howe, this was his first record with Yes, and that's him right there. And this was the album that really kind of sort of put him on the map, and it was partly because of one song, and it was right here. I've seen all good people. And you have heard that song. I've seen all good people turn their head to stay so... Anyway, I'm not going to be able to sing it right, but you've heard the song before. And that was on this album. And this is the one, again, that just kind of put him on the map. Now, the album, though, that is kind of the touchstone that if you're into Yes, and I learned this very early on, if you're into Yes, the album that you kind of really have to own is this one right here. And this is the one that actually came after the one that I just showed you. And this is the album Fragile. And this was the first one that featured the new keyboardist who was named Rick Wakeman. And then you end up with these four guys. You had Jon Anderson and Chris Squire, who were the guys that really they helped form the band. And then now you added Steve Howe, and then now you have Rick Wakeman. And then those four guys were just the classic Yes. They ended up changing drummers out, and they did have a little bit of a revolving door, but it was that foundation, those four guys, that really became an important. Looking back, just from a musicianship standpoint, these guys were these four great, just super well known, super respected, that kind of created that made the classic Yes sound that we all know. And the reason this album became one of the things that really put this on the map was a song on it that you've also heard before, which is, let's see where it's listed on here, right there, Roundabout. And everybody in the world's heard that song many, many times over. I don't remember the first time I heard the song, but I remember instantly liking it. And it was, if you had to like prog rock and you had to like Yes, that was an easy one to kind of get you in the door. I'd be the roundabout and gonna let you out and out in the day away. Anyway, most people have heard the tune. And if you don't think you've heard it just based on my terrible singing right there, go look up the song Roundabout on YouTube. It's this epic tune that has all these movements and all this amazing stuff. And yet it is so easily accessible by an average person. Because it has these funk elements, it has these really quiet elements. The singing is amazing. The guitar playing is great. The bass playing is just the whole song is just so. As a matter of fact, when you start talking about Yes, it almost becomes too obvious to mention that song. But it really was the tune that you look at that and you go back in Yes's library and you go, just that was such an important tune. And for a lot of people, that was the song where you go, okay, I get it. I understand these guys now, why this was such a big deal. And they were really known for these kind of epic pieces of music. And that was kind of a thing. They were prog rock kind of before prog rock became a thing. And they were just an incredibly important part of that whole movement. And so this went on for years and years and years, and they put out, and like I said, I just have those albums because you just kind of have to have those. And I have Tormato, and I'm not sure what else I have back in the collection, but those were a couple that were super, super important. So they went through the 70s, and they were just kind of always this, band that was just always there, and they were a kind of a musician band. And then when they got towards the end of the 70s, the band kind of started struggling a little bit. And Jon Anderson left the band, and Rick Wakeman left, which left a huge hole in this group. Well, something really interesting happened that would ultimately lead to this. And there was another band that you've probably heard of before called the Buggles. Now, where would you have heard of the Buggles before? The Buggles had this song, I think, I should have looked it up before, but I think it came out in 79, if I'm not mistaken. And it was a song called Video Killed the Radio Star. Video killed the radio star. And I believe it was the first music video to be played on MTV. And it was a really catchy tune. It was kind of a fun song. And inside this band called the Buggles, there were two people, two really important people. One of them was named Trevor Horn, and one of them was named Jeff Downes. Now, why do I bring them up? Well, when Jon Anderson and Rick Wakeman left Yes, one of the guys in Yes, actually, I think it was Chris Squire, met Trevor Horn and Jeff Downes, and basically ultimately recruited them to come be in Yes. So Trevor Horn was the singer for the Buggles. So since Jon Anderson left, Trevor Horn could come and sing for Yes. And then Rick Wakeman, who was the keyboardist, since he had left Yes, Jeff Downes, who was the keyboardist for the Buggles, would come and then replace him in Yes. And so they did. And they put out an album. And it was only one, just this one album. And then Yes kind of at that point just, for all intents and purposes, kind of broke up. They tried this one time without, here's the reality. You can't have Yes without Jon Anderson. You just can't. It's just not the same. And I know that but it just isn't the same band. Like I said, it's a little bit Imagine Rush without Geddy Lee. I mean, I guess you could create something and call it that, but without that voice, it's just not right. And so the band kind of disbanded at the time. And then Steve Howe, the guitarist for Yes, that we talked about a second ago, and Jeff Downes, the keyboardist for the Buggles that had just joined Yes, those guys went off with John Wetton and they formed Asia. And then what happened was Yes got back together, now missing Steve Howe and Rick Wakeman on keyboards, and they came back and they did something really interesting. So Jon Anderson came back into the band, Chris Squire came back into the band, and to replace Steve Howe, they got this new hotshot guitarist who wasn't really known, named Trevor Rabin. Trevor Rabin, you would have heard of him before because after Yes, he went on and started doing like soundtracks. And I remember, and I'm talking about a lot of soundtracks. I remember when I went and saw the movie National Treasure, the one with Nicolas Cage. When it got to the credits at the end, I remember looking up on the credits and I saw, Trevor Rabin? Wait, he did? Anyway, if you ever saw the movie National Treasure, he was the one that did the soundtrack. He scored that movie, and he scored a whole lot of movies. So anyway, but they picked up this hotshot guitarist. And a lot of us that played the guitar started hearing about him because of this album, because he had done all this really unique stuff. He started bringing all these really unique things from a guitar synthesizer standpoint into this new version of Yes. And then this is what's pretty interesting. Alan White, who was actually a drummer, had played with John Lennon. He'd appeared on Imagine. He'd appeared on Instant Karma. He had joined Yes many years earlier. And then when they reformed this version of Yes, Alan White became part of it. And then Tony Kaye, who was the original keyboardist before Rick Wakeman, now came back to the band. And then this became the new version of Yes. Now, and then they put out this album called 90125. And Jon Anderson back in the band, and then you've got this really cool, amazing lineup. And this ended up becoming their biggest selling album before or since. And partly because it just was so awesome. Now, a lot of people that were really into Yes back in the 70s did not appreciate this so much because it didn't have that quite the progressive rock feel that the kind of classic Yes with Rick Wakeman and Steve Howe had developed. And what ended up happening here is you ended up having, even though there was a lot of amazing musicianship on here, these songs were way more commercially accessible. And the one that's the most obvious is the song Owner of a Lonely Heart. And that song became huge. And that was the very first song on the album, Owner of a Lonely Heart, much better than a owner of a broken. You've heard that song before. It was a huge hit. And Trevor Rabin, all the tones that he had, the guitar work, it was just, it was just good. He was great. He was amazing. And for him to kind of enter the scene with that song and the guitar playing that he brought and the sounds and the tone, it was just incredible. Now, this album had a lot of great tunes on it. And the really, I think another note that he'd put in here under this video was that he didn't think there was a bad song on this album. And here's the deal. Hold On. You've probably heard that song before. It was an amazing tune. It Can Happen was a great, great song. Changes was a great song. Cinema, I think, won an award. And Leave It is another tune you have heard before because these songs were so commercially appealing. And they sold, and they were easy for people, an average person, to listen to, where a lot of progressive rock wasn't. And so this is why I say, when this album hit, it was almost like for a lot of people the first time they'd ever heard of Yes, even though they'd been around for about 15 years. It was because they'd kind of been over in their little progressive rock world with progressive rock fans. They got back together, put this album out, and then all of a sudden the whole planet was paying attention to them because these were much more easily accessible songs. Now, another thing about it, and this to me is one of the most important things. I want to show you something here. Look what it says here. And there's a reason I'm showing that. Well, there's a couple reasons. Produced by, who does that say right there? Trevor Horn. Trevor Horn was the singer for the Buggles who had replaced temporarily Jon Anderson as the singer when they did that one version that had Jeff Downes and Trevor Horn singing. Well, when Jon Anderson came back in the band for this album, Trevor Horn, who had replaced him as the singer, moved off and then just became the producer for the next album. Now, it turns out he is an unbelievably talented producer. And one of the reasons I say that is when I was a professional musician way back, we had a guy that worked with us a lot as a producer and as a sound guy, and he would go to all of our live shows and do all the sound. And one song that he would test almost every sound system on was this song right here, It Can Happen. I can't tell you how many times I heard that song because we'd be getting set up or we'd be in a place and we'd have the gear, whatever. And he would put that song on, throw the CD in, like CD. Again, this goes way back, back into the 90s. But he'd put that song on, It Can Happen, and every single time you hear it, you think, this is one of the most incredible sounding songs I've ever heard in my life. And the whole album's like that. So if you want to have an amazing aural experience, get some headphones and go listen to the song It Can Happen. And it has so many different sounds, it has so many different instruments. It is an amazing recording. It's a beautiful song. It's a beautiful song. But the recording, the production, is so fantastic, and which you can actually say about every single song on this album. The sounds that they use, the separation of the frequencies, the way they place things in, it is a pleasure. Even if you don't love the songs, it is one of those albums that is a pleasure just listening to it because it sounds so good. Did such a great job with it. Now, there's one other kind of fun thing about this record. And because a lot of people ask, where did you get the name 90125? What a strange thing to call an album, right? Well, it's kind of funny where it came from. And I'm going to show you where it came from right now. See that right there? 90125. This was the catalog number for this album produced by Atco. Is that right? Yeah, Atco. This was the catalog number for the album, 90125. And so that's just what they called it. Anyway, so I thought it'd be fun to go back and, again, read a couple of things about this record because it really was, it was a pivotal record in the history of Yes, for sure. because it sold so many copies. And it's interesting going back now because not only did it sell copies, not only did it sell a ton of copies, but it was one of those albums where the classic Yes fans, a lot of them didn't really like it because it was such a departure. And you see those kinds of things a lot of times when bands will go to the next level and become these monster acts. They alienate some of the old fans because they change it a little bit. They change it up. For me, even though I did like Yes, partly because I was supposed to as a young guitar player, like I said, I really did love this album. It was a really spectacular record. And correct, it doesn't really follow the old Yes formula, but it displayed some fantastic songwriting. It shows you just how great Jon Anderson's voice is just, in my opinion, just as good as ever in here. It's just so pure. It's set in the mix so well. It's just awesome. Okay, so now I'm going to share with you a couple of these things. What I found is a couple of record reviews about this, and they're kind of, one of them is really not really into it. There's another one that the guy, well, anyway, you'll enjoy this. Okay, so here's the first one. This is from the Southern Daily Echo, Thursday, December 15th, 1983. Okay, so to put this into perspective, the album was released on November 7th of 1983. So this is just about a month after it comes out. I love this. Yes, 90125. Yes, refuse to die. They just continue to decompose horribly before our eyes. Just when the hideous memory of their last tour had begun to fade, up springs a new lineup to trample on the reputation of one of Britain's finest rock bands. Having lost the vision which motivated their great albums, Jon Anderson now seems determined to take the band into the discos. Far better to have changed the name of the band than pervert the style so shamelessly. The last album of the real Yes was Tormato. Everything that has followed has shamed a great reputation. Anyway, that's it. It's very short, but guy clearly doesn't like it. And again, a lot of people really felt like when they got towards the end of the 70s, they had lost their way. And like I said, they'd lost their way so much. Jon Anderson's leaving, Rick Wakeman, and they bring the guys in from the Buggles. And you know, they're looking at that. Some of these people like, man, you just destroyed your reputation. And now this, you're destroying it even further. When in the big picture, you know, they're looking at this going, wow, that just bought me a lot of brand new, pretty awesome cars. This record did, because it sold so well. Anyway, so they come with positives and negatives, if you will. Okay, so now this one I think is kind of fun because it's a two-parter. It's a record review that somebody writes, and then there's kind of a response to it. And I when I read this, I thought this was a lot of fun. So this is by John McCurdy with Chris Dunnigan. This is from the Kitsap Sun, December 16th, 1983. So again, about a month after the album came out. Okay, so, and again, these are two guys that do this review. So this is John McCurdy's part. Yes is back. For Yes fans, this should come as good news. But I can't speak for Yes fans because I wasn't one of them when the group was popular in the early and mid-70s. What I like about this Yes album is precisely what Yes fans may not. All the elements that made Yes popular, sweeping neoclassical structures, and excellent vocal harmony and good progressive rock are there with the band, which includes most of the band's memorable members from days of old. The notable exception is Rick Wakeman, who left the band in 1973 to begin a solo career. What is missing from 90125 is that annoying tendency to get you hooked on whatever they were doing, then stop in the middle of the song, taking off on a jazz improvisation and never returning to the music that they started out with. Which is what they were, again, that's kind of what they were known for. These just on and on. It was a similar thing to what Jethro Tull was like. I mean, go listen to Thick as a Brick. They start out with this really kind of catchy, cool thing, and then they're off on all these other directions. And you're like, what happened to that catchy thing I was listening to? And then his point is, the thing that you love, that's really not a part of this record anymore. This time around, Yes has learned that it can have its jazz and play it too, by sticking with variations on a theme rather than by scrapping a perfectly good piece of music for some tangential nonsense. Of course, my tangential nonsense is probably a Yes fan's bread and butter. So what is the new album like? I'd say it is definitely Yes, but with a more mature approach. Excellent lyrical themes and a good driving rock music. At times, the Yes of 1983 borders on heavy metal, but not so much that it covers over the solid vocals and excellent sets of lyrics. By the way, this gets back to something we've talked a lot about on this channel, which is the term heavy metal was so broad way back then. I mean, even this, some people were throwing that in that category, and it obviously, eventually we got to the point where you go, no. Anyway, it's just interesting noticing how people would put it in those categories back then. Let's see here, but not so much that it covers over the solid vocals and excellent sets of lyrics. From the lead cut, Owner of a Lonely Heart, to the romantic final cut, Heart, 90125, is a new Yes and a very good one, and this person gives it 3.5 stars. Now, here's the response by this guy named Chris Dunnigan. I've got to confess a long-standing prejudice against Yes, which may contribute to my ill feelings about this new album. While I admit it is an improvement over the Yes of old, I still don't like the self-indulgence that passes as music. If, as I have said, Duran Duran produces melodies without lyrics, see random notes below, there's a whole other section of this article, of this column, then Yes puts together good lyrics without recognizable melodies. For some reason, the group has always placed 1 or 2 fairly good songs on an album, then filled the rest of the album with free-form junk. They may have shifted away from this attitude a bit, as you say, John. He's responding to the other article, but not enough for my taste. For those who like the hit song Owner of a Lonely Heart, as I do, I would suggest buying the 45. Don't waste your money on the album, or you may be very disappointed, as I have been time and again by Yes albums, which simply don't live up to the promise of their singles. And then he gives it 2 stars. Now, for me personally, for whatever it's worth, I totally disagree with that assessment. Because Owner of a Lonely Heart, it like it or not, it's a great song. And it sold like crazy because it was a great song. This album, Hold On, is a great song. It Can Happen is a great song. Changes is a great song. And Leave It. For me, all those are great pieces of music. Cinema is an instrumental, and it's pretty cool. And these other 3 songs, although not as great as the others that I listed, they're still really listenable, and they sound so good that you don't mind just listening to them, even though they're not quite as good as far as catchy kind of things that you just want to that really catch your ear, that kind of get stuck. These songs are not like that, but they're still excellent pieces of music, and they're recorded and produced so well that they're nice to listen to. So, to me, the album ended up being just a really, really solid album. And then they went on from here. I have their next album. I think the next one was Big Generator. I've got that one. And then they just never really recreated or lived up to this again. This was ultimately the high point for this band as far as album sales go. Now, for a lot of people, when you're kind of a Yes purist, you would definitely not agree with that. And you'd go back towards some of these other albums that I showed you earlier that really, really showed the progressive rock part of who they were, and that involved Steve Howe, that involved Rick Wakeman, because they really were an important part of that element of Yes. And Rick Wakeman, like I said, Steve Howe went off, and he ended up forming also the band GTR, which you remember from the 80s. And he did that one with Steve Hackett from Genesis. And as a matter of fact, Rick Wakeman even had, in the early 70s, some amazing solo stuff happen. He had an album called The 6 Wives of Henry VIII. And I've got that. And that was a pretty big seller. I mean, it really established Rick Wakeman as kind of a legend as a keyboardist. So anyway, all these guys were really, really great players. And that classic yes, it really did involve that. But again, getting way back to the very first, one of the first things I said in here, so much, just a little philosophical moment. Back in Denver, there's this really famous singer, and I heard her once talking about, I can't think of her name now, but she was talking about the value of the vocal line in a song. Because it is the thing, and this is just an interesting thing to think about. The voice is the thing that lets you as a person oftentimes enter into the music. Because it's the thing you connect with. You hear the voice, you hear the words, and even for a layman who doesn't play music and doesn't really understand it, that voice being there helps you get into it and then explore all the stuff inside the music. It may be really complicated stuff that you wouldn't be able to understand intellectually, but that voice allows you to get in and feel it and experience it. And so this singer that I was talking about from Denver made that comment once. You just have to have that a voice. Now there's a lot of great instrumental music out there, but it's just interesting how often you see these groups that have instrumental stuff and they'll add the songs in there that have a voice, and oftentimes it is that thing. That's the one that people relate to because the average person wants to hear that human voice on the other end. And getting back to what I said at the beginning, and I don't know what, I'm not passing judgment on what that person said. It is something interesting to think about, though. Jon Anderson, the singer for this band, for Yes, his voice is so beautiful. It allowed a lot of average people, and I'd put myself in there. Even though I am a musician to some degree, I don't always get the really complicated stuff that bands like Yes frequently do. But having that voice, Jon Anderson, that is such a beautiful sounding voice. It makes it easy for people like me, or easier for people like me, to appreciate and to listen to the music, and then begin to immerse yourself in all of the really interesting things that a band like Yes does. So it's interesting to see how often a voice like that becomes the signature part of a group like this. Hey, I hope you enjoyed that video. If you're not following the channel, please follow the channel, like the video. I'd love to get your feedback on all the different stuff. We covered so many weird little topics in here. I'd love to get your feedback on the things we talked about here. And also, a lot of people contact us about the channel and wanting to help out with things. And one of the biggest things you can do right now, we're trying to grow the channel. And one of the biggest things you can do is, if you've liked this video, or if you go on our channel, there's so many different videos. Find any of them that you like, copy the URL, and go put it on your Facebook page, go email it to people that you think would be interested in it, and just kind of tell people, throw it on Twitter or whatever, just kind of share it with other people that you think would be interested in what we're doing here. We have a lot of things that we're planning on doing through the course of this year once we hit certain thresholds, and some really cool stuff coming down the pipe, so that we're very excited about. So anyway, thank you so much for taking the time to watch these videos. We really appreciate your feedback. Again, please leave your comments. And with that, have yourself a fantastic day.